Thanks for coming today. I'll maybe try and tell you where we are, what's happening in New York right now, and then back up, and then tell you how we got where we are. And I just want to honestly start by saying some of you are probably better church planners than I am. Some of you probably have a bigger church than we have. So I am not here as the super expert who knows everything. We've certainly learned quite a few things, but I just want to start by posturing myself in a position of humility and say that I'm a learner and I'm trying to figure this stuff out just as much as any of you guys are. So I moved to New York 8 years ago to start what I thought was going to be a church so big that the city couldn't ignore it, and started with a little Bible study in my apartment in the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And so 8 years later, we're just getting ready to plant our 10th church. So we basically are a parish network of churches. We've got 7 in Manhattan, and then 1 in Queens, and then 1 in Brooklyn. And it's weird because our church is technically numerically a mega church in terms of how many people come to it, but you'd never know it if you tried. I mean, you just would never experience it as a pulpit, personality-driven church in any capacity. And our sweet spot seems to be reaching disenfranchised, cynical, secular people who, quite to their surprise, end up finding how relevant God is to all of life and existence. So that's about it. I married an American girl, broke my parents' heart, and she was that good looking that I was powerless. And so I've been married 15 years, got a couple of kids. I've got a son who's 13 who's come with me on this trip, and a 10-year-old daughter. Our church is called Trinity Grace Church, and so that's basically where we are right now. I'll tell you a bit of my story. I dropped out of high school when I was 16 to be an apprentice butcher. I was working in a butcher shop when I was 14 as an after-school job, and just, it's hard to say, but I was pretty good at butchering. And it's not really boasting if you're really good at that, is it? So good at butchering, and wasn't really interested in God or whatever. Thought it was actually pretty boring. I was a passionate young person. Everything. I was a writer, so I did a little bit of time just tagging everything that existed. There was a famous graffiti artist in Melbourne who I was just in awe of, and so I got into that for a bit. That's not exactly legal, so I got out of that a little bit later, and got into surfing. Anything I could get my hands on, I was full on into it. And so my thoughts on church and Christians were just like, these were the boring people, these were the legalistic people, these were the hypocrites. And I started going out with a girl who went to a church called Paradise Assemblies of God in Adelaide, and a youth group that was just cranking called Solid Rock, which I think ended up becoming Planet Shakers Church here in Melbourne. Russell Evans, the pastor of it, is the bloke that led me to Christ. And I was really just blown away by the passion of these people for God. And I thought it was a cult as well at the same time, so it was really disorienting. They're really passionate. I'm really drawn to it, but I'm also repulsed by it. And I remember, because it was Pentecostal, I didn't know anything about that. I just remember seeing everybody speaking in tongues and just thinking, I don't know much about God, but that's not from God. I just remember thinking that at the time. I remember thinking, if any of these people try and make me speak that gobbledygook, I want to smack them. And they would have these ministry times, and I'd see them coming for me, to try and lay hands on me, and I would just be like, don't you, it was really good. So I was able to avoid that for quite some time up the back. And I saw the movie Dead Poets Society, and it just woke something up in me. And I really became a Christian because I had all these longings in my heart, and all of these passions and all these desires, and the stuff I was trying to do to meet them and fill them, it wasn't working properly. And so I remember that going away on a retreat and being at the back of the room one night and seeing everybody down the front worshipping, praise pit, hands raised and all the rest of it, and just being really cynical about it. And I just been thinking, look at those people. Like, what are they even doing? And I just felt God speak to me, probably really clearly for the first time in my life, and just say, I want you to be one of those people. I want your worship. I want the passion of your heart. And it was terrifying. And so I was getting ready to leave, and there was this big, massive bloke doing security, and he says, you can't leave. And I said, yes, I can. He said, no, you can't. I said, okay, you're bigger than me, I can't leave. And so I ended up staying one more session, and it was in that session I actually became a Christian. And the message that I loved, the message that I resonated with so much was God wants to use young people to change the world. I'd never heard that. I'd never really thought about that. And all of these sermons about God uses teenagers, and most of the disciples of Jesus were kids. They were just young teenagers. And Daniel was 17 when God called him and all that. So I was 17 when I became a Christian. And I loved it. I loved, this is in the middle of, like, depending on who you talk to, some sort of revival that was happening, the Toronto Blessing at the time. And church was just a madhouse. And it was just incredible to be a part of. So I was just loving all of that. I'm working in the butcher shop as well. So it was really hard to sort of translate that experience back into a meat factory, the next day. So somewhere in all of that, it just got in my heart, maybe God could use me to change the world. And so I started to ask the question, what is the world and how would you change it? After all the hype, that all dies down. What is the world and how does you change it? So I got, somehow, I'm not quite sure how it happened, the desire to go to America entered into my heart. And I think it was actually The Cross and the Switchblade. That may have been it. I read that book and I was just like, gee, I want to have blokes sticking knives, popping my buttons in the back alleys of drug-infested New York. That sounds all right. It sounds like Elizabeth, where I was living at the time, a little bit too. But I'd like to have that in another culture at least. And so that was in my heart. And so I went to my youth pastor, a guy named Paul Geerling at that moment. I was like, I think God wants me to go to America. He goes, no, why would God want you to go to America? America's filled with Christians, just pumping out pastors out of seminaries like it's a factory. I said, I don't know, it's just in my heart. So I just spent some time praying and seeking God. I realised somewhere in there that I had a sort of a more intellectual component to my faith. It was not going to be nurtured in that environment. And so I went over to a church called Oakton Baptist Church, and Bible teaching church. I'd never really heard expository preaching. And this was a church that was connected with John MacArthur. And I just remember hearing expository preaching, and it just stirred my heart. And I was like, oh, wouldn't it be amazing if you could take all the vision, all the passion, all the power, and combine it with really thoughtful biblical preaching? Like, that would be something. But I didn't know that that was an option. And because there was a lot of infighting, everyone was blaming everybody else, and it was like the dead Bible thumpers were everything wrong with Christianity, and they needed reviving, and then the happy kippies had no theology, and so there was like no way of reconciling it together. And what began to form in my heart is that to change the world and to be a part of that really was about really understanding what God was doing in this time of history. And I realised that for the most part, the kingdom of God was going mad around the world. What was happening with the growth of the gospel in China, what was happening in South America, basically the growth of the kingdom of God and the gospel in Africa is just incredible. There was one place, or one sphere of the world where the church was just sucking wind, and it was in Western society. And I was from Western society, so I felt like I didn't have to do too much work to try to understand it. And I once heard Os Guinness say this. He said, there's three giant forces that will control the future of the next 100 years. Will Islam modernise peacefully? What will take the place of post-communist China? And will there be a third spiritual awakening in Western culture? And when I heard that, I was like, that's what I'm called to. That's what I want to go after. I want to see, the brilliance of God put on display through the church in Western culture. So I moved over to, I got a scholarship to go to Bible college in Georgia. And if you know anything about America, that was some culture shock. So I went to this tiny town 2 hours north of Atlanta called Toccoa, Georgia. Beautiful, by the way. And I was there doing the campus orientation. So classes hasn't started. And there's this gorgeous girl in the orientation group. And I just can't get my eyes off her. I love God, I love holiness, and I can't get my eyes off this girl. So I'm thinking at the time, the Aussie accent goes down pretty well with the Yanks. So I'm like, love, how are you? I just go over and all the rest of it, timed it nicely. And so I start going out with her. I call my parents. I'm in America 2 weeks. And I said, I've met the girl I'm going to marry. And they're like, oh, gee, I mean, have a bit of a look around, would you? You've been there 2 weeks. I was like, no, that's it. It's over. It's done. So that's the woman I married. So happily married. She's such an amazing woman. And just God in his sovereignty and kindness just matched me up with the perfect person for me. She's not a pushover. She's not a typical pastor's wife. She's aggressive. She's got an iron chin. Her resilience is off the charts, and she reckons I'm all right. So I think like that together was pretty good. So I move over to the US, and at this point I'm trying to figure out still what is the world and how does the world change. And so the only option, this is in 1997, the only option was the megachurch, right? I mean, that was the thing. There was no real paradigms or frameworks. Willow Creek was in its sweet spot. Rick Warren was putting his stuff out, and everybody was trying to figure out about church leadership and church growth. And I thought, well, if you want to change the world, you've got to get a church that's so big people can't ignore it. They can't say God's not relevant when there's that many people serving God and living for his kingdom. So I basically wormed my way into a megachurch. And the American megachurch is really like a club, which means once you've worked at one, it's like a good old boys club. You can get a job at any megachurch. You go, if you've worked at a megachurch before, yeah, okay. Or you can work at this one. It's like just all these transfers that would happen amongst megachurches. So so there's another part of the story. My best mate is a bloke named Darren Whitehead. He's an Australian guy as well. He moved over a year after me. And he was doing an internship in a church in Nashville. And he said, wouldn't it be amazing and wouldn't it be illegal amounts of fun if you and I were the youth pastors in this megachurch together? And so he said, why don't you come up and speak at this camp for us? And if it goes well, I bet I can talk him into hiring you or whatever. I was like, you're the intern, mate. And he goes, nah, I got favour. I was like, okay, sweet. So I come up and do this camp, and just like, as it all went to plan, they were like, how happy are you in your current ministry position? And I was like, I'm happy, but not as happy as I could be. And so anyway, moved to Tennessee, worked at First Baptist Church Franklin, the People's Church, big Southern Baptist megachurch. And I just had the time of my life. I was 23. It was Darren and I. We get to do with anything we wanted. And a lot of money, a lot of resources, a lot of kids. It went really, really well. And but it was that point that I learned about leadership. And I went to the first Catalyst conference that they ever held. And during one of the talks, Andy Stanley had a throwaway line about church planting. Just a throwaway line. And I remember sitting there thinking, you can start churches. You can actually start them. It had never consciously entered my mind that you could start churches. This is going to sound stupid. I naively believed Jesus started the church, and it had been rolling along a bit, and then there was the Reformation, and then here we were. It never consciously occurred to me. You had denominations, and they started and kept going. It never occurred to me that you could just start a church. And when I heard that, and that you could not get in trouble for starting things, but you would be rewarded for starting things, I was like, this is it. So I started trying to read everything I could on church planting. And at that time, I began to sort of put together through a bunch of research and thinking, I think the way that you change the world is not by building big churches, it's by shaping culture. And where is culture shaped and where is culture distributed? And I thought, for the most part, that happens in cities. So I'd never heard of Tim Keller. I'd never heard of city centre ministry. I'd never heard of any of this stuff. I just thought, well, what are the big culture engines of Western society? I thought, you got London, that does a pretty good job. But New York seemed like the place where all of these different industries, you had the UN there, you had Wall Street was there, you had a bunch of transnational corporations whose headquarters are there. You had the arts that were centered there. There were so many things there. Wouldn't it be incredible if we could move to New York and have a go at that? So this was in my head about church planting, and but all I'd known at this point, I'd moved to Orlando. I'd left Nashville. I'd moved to Orlando to get training from a megachurch pastor to be mentored in church planting. And can I just say this, that the worst training possible you can get for church planting is being mentored by a megachurch pastor. I can't think of a less relevant mentorship for church planting. Good church planting training is try and reach your friends for Jesus and see how that goes. And if it goes pretty well, you're probably a church planter. And if it doesn't, you might not be. But having a guy who's used to having multiple staff, millions of dollars of resources to allocate, influence, respectability, is not the bloke that's going to teach you how to do all that stuff. So I came to New York filled with faith. We sold our house, made a bunch of money. We put $100,000 of our own money into our church plant. It was just like, we're going all in, we're burning the ships. Took a team. Now that ministry, just side note, this is not to impress anybody, but to give you sort of a sense, that ministry had grown from 200 people to 1,400 people in a year in Orlando. So our student ministry was the talk of the US, speaking at all these conferences on student ministry and all this sort of stuff. And so I had a little bit of swagger in my step, and I thought, we're going to go to New York and we're going to show them. Here comes a church so big this city can't ignore it, in a culture-shaping center of the world. So I rock up to New York and realize pretty quickly, hang on, where's all the people I'm going to preach to and cast this amazing vision? Oh, there isn't any, because I don't have a church. I have to start one. And it was a real wake-up call. And I realized that all of my instincts and all of the things that I've been trained in were practically irrelevant for church planting. And I stumbled across a book that just jacked me up and caused me to massively overreact. It was Organic Church by Neil Cole. So I picked that up one night and I was like, oh, Struth, I've done everything wrong. And so it was so much going on. So we moved to the city, we get settled in, there's no one around, and we just basically start praying a lot. One of the things I'm so thankful for my Pentecostal tradition is just their hunger for the presence and power of God and their emphasis on really believing that the promises of God are not for another time, but they're for now. And that God wants to do the stuff that's in the Bible. He wants to see that happen now. And so there's a little prayer from Habakkuk, and I know the context of Habakkuk, so don't email me and say it's out of context. I'm familiar with it. But there's a little prayer of the prophet Habakkuk where he says, Lord, I've heard of your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds, Lord. Renew them in our day. In our time, make them known. In wrath, remember mercy. And I remember everybody talking about how much wrath Western culture deserved for its rebellion against God. But there was this ancient prayer that was, God, I want to see all the stuff. I want to see who you are and what you can do in my time. And that just became the prayer of my life. And so when we moved to New York, we weren't sure what to do. We didn't know how to do anything. So we just would pray. And we would pray and we would seek God. And so I had this rare window of time where I didn't have a church. And I just would spend whole days praying around New York City. And it's the way I discovered the city. I would literally go to a neighborhood and go, okay, this is the East Village, is it? All right, well, I want to find out about the East Village. I just walk the entire East Village and spend the whole time praying. What is the East Village? What's its culture? Who are the people here? How does this work? And we just saw God begin to do unbelievable things in answer to prayer. Every Friday night, we had a half night of prayer where we'd gather on this roof overlooking Midtown Manhattan on 42nd Street. And we just would pray and pray and pray. And then because prayer's hard work, you know that. Then we'd stop and, have some coffee and then press back in. And then we'd stop and we'd press back in. And we just started to see miraculous answers to prayer. People started coming to Christ. We had a couple of instances that were just so faith-building, where people we've been trying to reach, totally resistant, we just would dedicate a prayer time to them, and they would text or call during that prayer meeting saying, never going to believe this, but I want to give my life to Jesus. And so we just saw all this amazing stuff, and it just filled us with faith and fanned us on. So it was really oriented in prayer. We basically, I didn't have any real models of how to plant a church. I didn't know what to do, so I had all these great leadership instincts that I'd learned, working in all these different environments. And so it was just about momentum. So get momentum, steward momentum, push momentum, build momentum, thank God for momentum, and then tell everybody, wow, look at our momentum. And so that was sort of like what we did. And our first service was sort of a weird service. We didn't have an official launch day until I knew that we could pack it out. I didn't want to just, have like a sucky little crew and be like, ta-da! I know the flyers were amazing, and I know that we promised that this was going to be the best kids ministry your kids have ever been in, and all of that stuff, but there's actually 9 of us. I just didn't want to do it. So went really, really well. We started with about 300 people at our first service, which was really amazing. And then that sort of shrunk down a bit. But it was really an important day. This girl that we'd been praying for, she was an alcoholic, she was an actress, she wasn't into God. And we'd poured into her and she was so resistant. And I remember after preaching the talk, I was out the front, just on the street on West 72nd Street, the Upper West Side, and people come running out. They're like, John, you got to come quick. I'm like, what's wrong? They're like, this girl wants to give her life to Jesus and she wants you to pray with her. And I was like, burst into tears. And I was like, yes. Went back in and prayed. And it was just like this definitive moment of salvation that our church launched, but it launched with people coming to Jesus. And then, so I at this point didn't really understand what New York was or what a New Yorker was. I had a dyed black faux hawk. I had my chin pierced and I had gauged earrings because I'd been working in Orlando with all these goth kids and all these hipster kids and all the rest of it. So, any of you ever been to the Upper West Side of Manhattan? Anyway, yeah, I mean, it's not really like a rock concert, goth-oriented sort of environment. And I would go to the park and sit down, and then mums would get up and move. I'm like, yeah. And I just basically had never really heard about contextualization or what that was or whatever. I was just passionate for God, filled with faith, praying and all the rest of it. And then this girl comes up to me one day and she goes, I love your church. She said, I've just moved here from Alabama and your church is just like my church back home. And she meant it as a compliment, but it just hit me and it just made me think, I don't know everything about America, but I did see Sweet Home, Alabama, that song's a different place with an accent. And I'm in the middle of New York City. And if she is comfortable easily transitioning from Alabama to Manhattan, I've got a problem. Our church at the time was called Origins Church. And I didn't know that Origins was a really rapidly growing makeup company in New York as well. So that was unfortunate. And so I would meet people and they'd be like, I'd say, what do you do? I work at Origins. They go, oh, that's fantastic. I love their eye products. I'm like, we don't have any eye products. They go, what are you talking about? It's a makeup company. And serendipitously, as we would plant new congregations, Origin stores would honestly plant up within eyesight of them. I was like, what is happening? So we began to sort of understand the idea of contextualization, that maybe I've planted the wrong sort of church. And so I felt like at the time I was the only guy I knew who was going, we're doing hymns. We're doing hymns. We're doing liturgical. We are joining the church calendar. We are not doing contemporary music, We were having the reverse worship war that other generations had bled to defy. We were coming back in saying, can we get some violins? Can we pay a violinist? And it was really painful because we've been building basically with contemporary, like relevant, angsty, postmodern worship. And all it was attracting was these Christians from other churches who didn't have that option in New York at the time. We were that cool that, when people would there was a while where this was cool in America, where somebody would teach and then they'd have an artist painting. And I just go, painting's for the birds. What's this painting? They're not even that good. So what I would say is, I had this bloke who was a world-class graphic designer, and he would have Photoshop up on the wall doing graphic images, the coolest stuff. He designed Relevant magazine, if any of you guys have ever heard of that, like back in the day. So he's the founding graphic designer of Relevant magazine. And it was the coolest stuff you'd ever seen, and then we'd email it to everybody at the end of the night so they had a visual memory of the night we had together. So everything we did was like the edge. And then I was like, can we listen, get rid of the drums, man. Let's just have a string quartet. Can we? And so people were just disoriented. And a lot of our staff were really torn, and it was really, really painful. I had to ask people to leave our church. Hey, thanks so much for coming to our church. Can you please leave our church? Because we're not a contemporary Christian church anymore. We're going to do something a little different. It was really painful. It was really hard. But out of it, we began to realize that if we were going to love the city, if we were really going to be a part of touching it and understanding its culture, that we had to contextualize for it. And it was really painful, but it ended up being a really good process. We led pretty well through it, I think, for the most part, and we learned a lot of lessons. So we changed our name to Trinity Grace Church, and here's the official take, okay? Every religion is trying to answer two questions. Who is God, and what is salvation? The historic, distinct Christian answer has always been, God is Trinity, and salvation is by grace. Now that sounds pretty good, doesn't it? That's not true at all. I mean, that's true, but not the reason. The reason is because all the great one-word historic church names in a 400-year-old city were taken. Calvary Church was taken. Blah, blah. So we started mashing church historic terms together. Trinity Hope Church, Calvary Grace Church. Bing, bing, what? Trinity Grace Church is available on GoDaddy? Buy it. And that was a little bit of Trinity Grace Church. So it's ended up going really, really well for us. One of the things we realised is that I would say to people, "What's the name of your church?" Origins, and would often have people say, "Is that a cult? Like, are you? How old are you?" I was like, 28, and you're from Australia, and you've moved here to start an innovative spiritual community. Yeah, it's a cult, isn't it? Just be honest. It's okay, I can handle it. It's a cult. No, it's not a cult. It's innovative spiritual community. It's crazy. So, but now that it's called Trinity Grace Church, people go, "Oh, it sounds like it's 100 years old. It's probably a mainline liberal. You guys aren't proselytizing evangelicals here to mess with the culture of New York," and so they just kind of don't blink or bother us. But when they meet us, they're really surprised. They go, "Oh, I thought the church was dying, and your church seems pretty traditional, but your church is filled with young people. What's actually happening in your church?" It's really surprising to me. So that's been a part of our journey. So that was a part of the process of contextualization. Just for the last few minutes here, I'll talk about how we do church and why we decided to do church like that. Our church had grown to probably about 1,000 people, which was amazing, in 3 different locations, and it was all built on 1 or 2 people's gifts. So it was like pulpit driven, it was sermon driven, and it was basically the church was built and defined by my gift of teaching, which is not as good as Tim Keller's, but there wasn't many other teachers, so there were some people who were coming along. So it was going pretty well, and we were loving it. We're in the Upper West Side, we're on the Upper East Side, and then we were in Chelsea. And it was going really well. And then I just had this crisis, a personal crisis, that is so hard to explain and so hard to articulate. But it was just basically God revealing a bunch of sin and pride in my heart. And the sin was so deep and the pride was so deep, I actually couldn't even identify that that's what it was. So I had to leave the city for a bit. And the big crisis that really, really happened is that I'd never really heard Tim Keller. I'd visited Redeemer, but there was other speakers speaking, and they were pretty boring. And so I was like, that's it, I'm not into that. And then I heard Tim Keller a few times. I was like, oh my goodness. He had a talk called The Gospel in Yourself. And I almost fainted at the end of the talk, just in awe. I was like, oh, that's glory. I was under the weight. It was unbelievable. And so I started realizing, oh my goodness. And then there was a little church, you guys probably haven't heard of them, called Hillsong, that were coming over to New York. And so I just thought, you've got the best teacher, best living teacher alive, and some of the best, most popular worship on planet Earth, and some little high school dropout butcher like me in the middle of it all. Like, what have I really got to offer here? And so I couldn't figure it out. What's wrong with me? I don't understand this. So I left the city for a bit, went out fasting, seeking God, trying to make sense of it all. And then I still couldn't get to the bottom of it. I actually really want the kingdom of God to grow here. I actually don't just care about my church. I want to see a spiritual awakening in Western culture. What is this? Because what I want and what's actually in my heart don't match up. And one day I was walking across the George Washington Bridge and praying, and just felt God speak to me and just say, here's what the problem is. You are a tutor and you're not a father. And what you feel is threatened, that you're going to lose pupils and students to other teachers. And that's not what I've called you to. I've called you to be a father. And fathers want the best tutors possible to raise their children to maturity. They're not threatened by other great ministries. They embrace them because the vision is the maturity of others. And so I felt God just really say to me, you're called to be a father, not a tutor. If you lean into this, you'll live in freedom. And if you don't, you're going to deal with this. And it was like a spell broke, like, oh my goodness. It was just a really prolific thing. So we came back and we said, this church is too built on me. And God uses leaders. I'm not anti-leadership at all. I'm all about leadership. But I came back and I said, we've got to build something that's going to scale. If we want to really see God do something in this city, if we really want to plant churches, not just plant a church, we're going to have to figure out how to raise up leaders. This has to be about not just tutoring people with general information, but this has to be about investing in people and raising up spiritual sons and daughters to be a part of a movement that God wants to do. So that little revelation redefined everything about our church. And I simply said, we're going to be the church that finds young people, believes in them, equips them, invests in them, funds them, and sends them out. That's what our church is going to be. We're going to be that church. So at first it was hard because people didn't like having other guys come in and teach. And the other guys were learning to preach. And it was not even fair. If you preach once a month or once every 2 months, it's like you're preaching for the first time in your life. When you preach every week, it's easy. There's a rhythm. You preach to a book of the Bible. You know where it's going. But when you're coming in, you feel like a guest teacher. So I feel like we led pretty well through it just by casting vision and explaining why we were going to do this. And then our people slowly began to get it. They started to say, it's so much better to have a vision for planting a church that can actually serve a neighborhood rather than sucking people out of a neighborhood to attend a service somewhere else. It's actually really good to have a guy in a neighborhood with a compelling team that really believes in this neighborhood, can contextualize the ministry and church for it, is still a part of a larger church family, and they get their own sphere to run in and all the rest of it. So we started doing this, and our people just bought into it. And so we try to recover. I don't have really an ecclesiological background. I don't have a tribe. And I sort of wish I did, but it's really hard to join a tribe. So if I want to be a Presbyterian, I've got to stop planting churches and leading the church that I'm leading, go back to school so I can learn how to do what I'm already doing, and then do an internship under someone who probably hasn't done what I've done so that I can get permission to do what I was already doing. And that just seemed broken to me. And so I wasn't opposed to it. If I had been a Presbyterian, I would have planted as a Presbyterian. If I'd been in the AOG, I would have planted. I just came out of a non-denominational suburban megachurch. It was really hard to join one. So I didn't have all these understandings of things connected to do with the rest of it. We said we're just going to have to be our own sort of little tribe then. We'll be friends with everybody we can, and we'll just sort of move forward and build. So we borrowed some language, the parish language, which wasn't particularly popular at the time, and we love the idea of a parish. We define a parish, our version. Tell me if I'm wrong, I'm open to correction. Our version, we say a parish is a geographical area of spiritual responsibility. So it's like what happens in that area is that's our stuff, what happens in that area. Not just what happens in the church, and not just what happens in the Christian programs, but that area, if we really want to see the kingdom of God advance, we've got to take responsibility for more than just church planting and church programs. So that redefined our mission. We discovered missional communities really, really early on. So there's a bunch I could say about that, but I probably don't want to. We planted a bunch out of them and learned a bunch of stuff, and then really began to figure out the process of identifying leaders, raising leaders up, sending leaders, and empowering leaders. And that basically catches us up to where we are today. So the thing I'm most excited about is for right now, we've sort of planted one church a year, and we've got no growth goals. We don't have a written, stated goal. We're just trying to really follow the Holy Spirit and be faithful to the things God's called us to. But we're at the point now where several of our churches are pregnant with church plants within themselves. So everything we've done right now has been one at a time. And it's getting to the point where next year it could be 4 churches that we plant. And it's all just execution on core fundamentals of discipleship and leadership empowerment. And so there's a bunch of stuff we don't do well, but there's a few things we do really, really well. And we just execute consistently on that because we feel like God's called us to it. And so we're excited to see what happens. The year after that, we might not plant any churches. We've got no gun to our heads. Every time you plant a church, the church that sends it needs to replenish and rest and develop more leaders and do more outreach. So there's no gun to our head, but I really am excited to see what God does in the next few years in New York.